Extroverts and introverts. We approach life completely differently, don't we? We both want the same thing. We just go about it different ways. And so, for example, this whole COVID thing, how you introverts have handled it. Like your boss calls you up and says, "Hey, I'm going to need you to stay home from work. Is that okay?" And you're kind of like, well, that's just a burden I'll have to take on. So, and then, this mandate by the government kind of, hey, we're going to be shutting things down. We're going to need you to be socially distanced. And all you introverts are kind of like, I'll just take one for the team here. I'll be a superhero for the world right now. and so you welcome kind of all this shutting down. Meanwhile, all the extroverts, everything is, this is kind of like crippling you in so many ways. It's because you like to get up inside people's bubbles, right? Their little hamster wheels that they have that you like to climb in there and hug them. And if brotherly kisses was still a thing, that would be you. You would welcome that. And so this is killing you. It's crippling you, this whole COVID thing. And so I remember a few years ago, I was wrestling with, what am I? Am I an introvert? Or am I an extrovert? I was kind of struggling with this, and then someone brought up this idea of, here, answer this question. This will tell you whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. They said, where do you get your energy from? In other words, where do you recharge when you're worn out? Okay, they said that. So ask that. Do you recharge by, if you've had a long, tiring week, I just need to get away by myself, get home, sit on the couch, open a good book, and that'll refill me? Or are you on the other end, you have a hard week, just stressful, and then you just need to go out and spend time with your friends and just get away, right? If that's you, you're an extrovert. If you're at home on the couch, you're an introvert. So I heard that, and I thought, well, I must be an introvert because I like just to kind of get away. And so, but then there was a time in my life where things were kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, if you want to call it dark, or just, I was getting stressed and just heavy, and I thought, with my new information, well, I'm an introvert, so I'm just going to stay away from people right now so I can get recharged, become healthy again. And so for a period of weeks, maybe months, friends would call me up and say, hey, let's go out, let's go hang out. I'm like, no, I need to take care of myself. I'm just going to stay home and recharge a little bit. But as the weeks passed, I found that things were not getting better. I found that I wasn't getting healthier. I was finding that the darkness was not subsiding, that it was getting more challenging for me. And I realized something. I realized that all people, need both alone time and together time, just for different reasons, okay? So you introverts, when you're at home, snuggled up with your pet, with your book, and just trying to get away from the world, that's good. You need that time to recharge, but you need relationships. You need together time in order to be healthy. And then you extroverts, you need time with your friends. You need to be up in their bubbles, right? You need that time to recharge, but you also need that time away from people, alone, in order to reflect, in order to think, in order to be healthy. We need both. Whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, you need the alone time and the together time. The challenge is this, that we live in this Zoom world right now. I'm not three-dimensional. I'm just kind of this 2D flat thing on your screen. And so how do we do community in the middle of this scenario, right? And so that's the series that we're in right now. We're calling it Together. How to have meaningful relationship, how to have meaningful connection in a digital, virtual world. And that's something we've been wrestling with as a leadership team. How do we help this? And so we're going to be talking about this for the next 4 weeks, and 3 weeks from today, like Pastor Jason was sharing, August 23rd, we're going to be doing our house churches, and we're wanting everyone to get involved in either a virtual house church, an in-person in someone's home house church, or in service here during the service, house church. And so we want you to get involved in that, and that's going to be our push for a little bit because we think community is so important. It's not something that you can just delay because there's effects that come from delaying. And so having active, meaningful relationships, in other words, the church, is so important to your well-being that I wanted to take a look at some scripture today that shows the benefits of having meaningful relationships when we struggle. It's important to have relationships, period, but I think it goes to another level when we're going through seasons of difficulty, all right? And so I want to look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, beginning in verse 12. And to set this up a little bit, Paul is writing to the church in Thessalonica. And just to tell you, give you a little summary of what he's going to be hitting on, he's going to be talking about the relationship between the church leadership and the body. And he's saying, listen, it's important that the leaders of the church care for the body, but it's also true that the church body needs to care for the leaders. And then he goes into within the body. Now, it's important that the leadership cares for the body, but the body needs to care for its own members as well. Like, we need to care for one another, okay? And then he goes into the third part where he's talking about the relationship of the church with the Spirit. The focus I want to take today, though, is on that middle section of where we connect and care for one another, all right? And so here's the deal. Life is tough, but it's even tougher in isolation. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 12, we begin there. It says this, "Now we ask you, brothers and sisters," so he's talking to the church, "we ask you, brothers and sisters, to acknowledge those who work hard among you, who care for you in the Lord, and who admonish you. Hold them in the highest regard and love because of their work. Live in peace with each other." He's talking about the leadership and the church body. Now here's the part I want to zero in on. "And we urge you, brothers and sisters," he's talking about the body, "warn those who are idle and disruptive, encourage the disheartened, and help the weak. Be patient with everyone. Make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always strive to do what is good for each other and for everyone else. Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." When you look at verse 14, he highlights 4 tough, challenging seasons that we all go through. At some period, at some time in our life, we all go through something like these 4 seasons. He talks about those who are disruptive. And sometimes we'll have a disruptive season, and that's just where things are not going well, and you find yourself frustrated at how things are working out. It's kind of like my 2-year-old when I look at him and I say, "No, son, I don't want you doing that." He doesn't just kind of like, "Okay, Dad, that's cool." He's kind of, he throws things sometimes. Like he'll jump on the floor and start doing the whole, hammer fist, like MMA stuff. And I'm like, and he's frustrated, right? And he's showing it. He's being disruptive. So he's like getting in the left-hand lane on Highway 64 and he's going 50 and he's loving everyone honking at him. He's intentionally being disruptive, right? And we go through these seasons in our life. And Paul says, if that's where you are, church body, warn them, because that's not healthy. Warn them that if they continue down this road in the lane going 50, that it's going to cause problems. It's not going to be good, right? And he says, also the person who is idle, warn them. So again, sticking with the car analogy, if you think about the person who turns their car on, it's running, it's idling, but it's just not going anywhere, right? Paul says that that's a problem as well. But we get in these seasons like this. Sometimes like the fire of the Lord, it's present, it's just not burning hot. Like it's not that you quit believing in God, you've not quit believing in Jesus or Scripture, or you're just not really applying anything. The last time you repented of anything was just eons ago. You can't even remember the last time you were moved by the voice of the Holy Spirit, and you're idle. And Paul says, warn those people. Because if you continue that out, if you play that out, it doesn't work out well. warned them that being disruptive, being idle, does not produce fruit. And we go through those seasons, though. We all have that. And then Paul talks about a third season. He talks about the disheartened season. And this is that season where really your hope gets let down. You were anticipating something, maybe you were praying for something, and you thought God was going to kind of make this happen. And then, a relationship maybe develop, or this opportunity that was going to unfold, and then you start to take steps in obedience, and then nothing. And you're just kind of disheartened. You lose hope a little bit. Maybe your confidence starts to be shaken a little bit. And Paul says, those people who are in a disheartened season, encourage them. And then he talks about a fourth season. It's the season of weakness. And he says, now these people, in this time of weakness, it's not something, they're not there because of a lack of will, a lack of desire, or lack of effort. It's just things have become too much for them. It's too much for them to carry. It's too much of a burden. Some of my black brothers and sisters are in this situation right now where they're just this conversation that we're having as a nation over and over and over again. It's just heavy and tiring and wears you out, right? And so Paul says those who are in the weakened season, maybe it's someone who's dealing with addiction or a temptation that beats them every single time. They're just spiritually weak. They can't sustain it. Not because, again, a lack of will or desire. And Paul says those people who are in that kind of a season, help them. Shoulder that burden with them. So Paul says if there's anyone who is idle or disruptive, warn them. If anyone is in the season of weakness, help them. If they are disheartened, encourage them. And with everyone, be patient. All of those seasons, be patient, right? Because these things, you're not just in and out, just with a little encouragement, just with a little help. Be patient with them. And here's why. Because when we go through difficult, challenging seasons, our natural inclination is to do what? It's to withdraw. It's to pull away from community. I'm not going to reach out because they won't understand. I'm not going to reach out because they will judge me. If I reveal these things, it will skew my reputation. It will skew their lens of how they view me. And so we don't. We retract. And so when we're going through these hard times, it's easy for us to isolate ourselves because we don't want others around. We don't want to cry one more time over that situation. We don't want to have to explain ourselves once again, to bring out all those emotions and have to hash through them again. But the more we pull away, the darker the situation becomes. And the reason is because God has created us. He's created you. He's created me for community. He created us to be around one another, to encourage, to help, to shoulder, to build up, to warn, to correct, to speak life into us. And when we're too tired, when we're too broken, we're too emotionally weak, too much to even read His Word, too much to even pray, we can withdraw. And the problem with that is when we're really hurting, it's too easy. The option is too easy to just begin to isolate ourselves. But we all know the reality is that may be the simplest way, the easiest way, but that's not necessarily the best thing for us. And so here's where things get really challenging. That's just life as normal, right? Life is normal. We go through those seasons, but now I want you to add COVID. Now I want you to add a mandated separation. Now I want you to put a veil hiding you even more over life and interaction and one another and touch and all those things that we're made and created to have. Add that into it. And isolation becomes that much easier. There's a doctor, medical doctor, his name is Atul Gawande. They describe a study of nearly 150 U.S. naval aviators who returned. They were in prison in Vietnam, and he wrote this about them. He said, some prisoners whose only social contact was a food tray shoved through a slot became catatonic or developed autistic features. Still others had panic attacks or became extraordinarily aggressive. These symptoms suggest neurological damage. Neuroimaging studies confirm that isolation creates the same level of anxiety in the brain as does physical distress. The neural signs of social pain look a lot like the signals created by physical pain. Without sustained social interaction, the human brain may become as impaired as one that has incurred a traumatic head injury. Do you hear what that's saying? The effects of social isolation, if you take and extend that out, it's the same effects as if someone hit you in the head and caused blunt trauma. The same effect. The American Psychological Association, they had this paper, The Risk of Social Isolation. They cited a 2018 survey by Cigna. They had 20,000 participants in the survey, and 40% of the people took this survey indicated this, that they sometimes or always feel that their relationships are not meaningful and that they feel isolated. 40% of people. In this paper, they state that the social isolation has damaging effects that lead to premature death. And they begin to ask themselves, so they got this data, and they asked themselves, okay, we know people are lonely. 40% are saying they're lonely and feel isolated. But the question is this, has it always been this way? And we're just now becoming aware of it because we can test it and we can find data that kind of says this. Is this something new, or this has always been a condition of humanity? And they said, well, but there are indicators of social isolation that is increasing. And they cited these things. They said more than 25% of people live alone. More than half of people are unmarried. The number of children per household has declined. The rates of volunteerism has declined. And there's an increase of people identifying as non-religious. Public health researcher Dr. Cassandra Alcaraz, she said this, our research really shows that the magnitude of risk presented by social isolation is very similar in magnitude to that of obesity, smoking, lack of access to care, and physical activity. Social isolation has damaging effects on the person, physically, socially, emotionally, spiritually. It hurts us. Now again, imagine that damage and you're going through a difficult season. A tough season that we talked about, where you're weak and you have no strength, where you're disheartened and you're losing hope, where you're idle and you have no motivation to move, where you're disrupted because you're so frustrated. Imagine being in one of those seasons and you're forced into isolation, where you're naturally drawn to anyway. You know, the animal kingdom, we know this about animals. You watch Discovery Channel. The enemy, the lions, the leopards, they always prey on who? They prey on the weak and the isolated. And the devil does that same scheme. In fact, 1 Peter talks about that. He says, your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. The devil, your enemy, loves the isolated individual. The one who's living in fear, who's feeling weakness, who's feeling disheartened. He loves to prey in the mind of that individual. And so let me challenge us this morning to this, for your health. You and I must put effort into meaningful community in order to experience meaningful community. Meaningful community isn't just going to happen. You and I are both going to have to put some level of intentionality into making sure that this happens. In other words, this is great. What we're doing right here in this room, what you're watching right now, we have great, phenomenal worship. We have good, solid teaching, I think. We have all these things in place. This is great. But good teaching and good worship in community is exponentially better. Exponentially. Lucy Shaw wrote this book. She's an author. She wrote this book called God in the Dark Through Grief and Beyond. And Margaret Smith wrote a little review about it. And she wrote this. I thought this was great. Through the book, the author, Lucy, calls to God, asking like the psalmist, "Where are you? I call, but you don't answer. You have left me here alone." If she hasn't abandoned God in this crisis, and if God has promised to be with her always, then where is he? Why doesn't he make himself known? This is her aching prayer, and she never knowingly receives a satisfactory answer. Through the book, friends flit in and out like fireflies, giving off brief sparks in the darkness, telling Lucy in 1,000 thoughtful ways that they love her. But while she appreciates these friends, Lucy never seems to connect the two wires of where is God and here are God's people. In other words, Lucy's going through a difficult trial. She's testing and asking, God, where are you? Meanwhile, people who love Jesus and love her are floating in her life like fireflies. They're just brilliantly shining the light, and then they're popping in and out of her life, and she never makes the connection of, God, where are you? And that yet the people of God are coming into her life. She never connects these two, that maybe God is working through people in her life. Maybe God is answering her prayers and reaching out to her through the people of God. Smith's insight is that God often makes his presence known through his people, in nurturing those who are weak, and caring for those in distress, by encouraging those who are fearful, and if necessary, disciplining those who are in need, or who require it. I like this, though. Paul turns it seems to be kind of an abrupt shift in his teaching. He goes to encourage one another, help one another, and warn one another. And then he goes kind of into this rejoice always and pray continually and give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will. My thought is this: there's importance in what we do when we gather together in worship and in teaching and in community. There are times when a group of believers can do what an individual believer cannot do themselves. For example, there have been times in my life where I was in a season of like one of those tough seasons. And you've been there before, where sometimes you don't know how to pray anymore. Sometimes you just don't have hope, and you're just internally exhausted, spiritually exhausted, you're questioning, whatever it is. And I've been in situations where I go and I'm in a church, or I'm in a meeting with leaders, and I just don't have it, right? You've been there. You're in that tough season. And you're sitting there in the body of believers, and someone prays. And their prayer feeds you. Your prayer echoes what your heart is wanting to pray. And maybe you go into a time of worship and you hear a praise that your heart has been yearning to praise. And you hear some worship that your heart longs to worship. And they're almost worshiping on your behalf. And you're encouraged just by the presence of the people. And I think this is the profound thing about community. We often think that when Paul talks about encouraging one another and helping one another and warning one another, that that's always a direct thing, and that plays a part, like going one-on-one and encouraging one another. But we forget about the aspect of being in community and the encouragement and the blessing that comes from when you rejoice with others, when you pray with others, when you give thanks with others, that somehow in that, even just being in that context, how it blesses you. And it's so important. It's kind of like this residual part of just being in the presence of the body that blesses you. And we miss that. And so that's why we have to work at some level of intentionality in being in community. And we want you to be intentional. Every Sunday at 10:30, to take this time and move it from just you in your home, in your pajamas, to some element of you. If you need to practice precautions, you be a little more cautious, than being in a virtual house church. text in, let us know. We'll get you part of a virtual house church. Or if you're able to do an in-person house church, if you'd like to host a house church and then be like 7 to 10 people in a person's home, same people every week, practicing social distancing, mask, things like that. If you want to get involved in that, and then it's just a little bit of community. Or if you want to, the third option would be if you want to come here on a Sunday morning, we'll practice social distancing and masking and all those things, precautions here. And we're limited to a 25% capacity here. But if you want to do that, you would need to RSVP. But we want to really encourage you to get involved in one of these three levels, because we know the effects of social isolation is damaging. We know the effects when you're going through a tough season in isolation is long-term damaging. We know the blessings that happen in community is tremendous, and we need it. So join a house church. And the good thing about this, and that I love, that we always wrap our sermons, our messages up with communion. It's a reminder of this, that Jesus never leaves us nor forsakes us. You want to talk about isolation? You're never fully isolated from the presence of Christ. When I was a kid, I remember my Sunday school teacher whispering this. She said, Brian, never forget that Jesus is only a whisper away. He's only a whisper away. And maybe that's you here today. Maybe you're in this social isolation. Maybe you're in a dark, hard, tough season right now. Listen, Jesus is only a whisper away. But the other part is be in community, because the people of God can move on behalf of the hands of God. So let's move forward in community.